Let's finish up this problem at the bottom of page 6 on lesson 2 in module 6. We ended our last video after graphing the line. We said, we really don't need a t-table because y equals 3 is either vertical or horizontal. Since it only goes through the y-axis and never the x, that means it must be horizontal, and we draw it through at 3. So we were getting ready to answer the question at the end of the last video. The x-intercept is where it crosses the x-axis. And look here, I don't see any line crossing that x-axis. Remember, we don't put 0 for that. We write none. So the x-intercept is none. The directions also ask us to find the y-intercept. So here's our y-axis. We know the y-intercept has x equals 0, so 0, 3 should be our y-intercept. So it never crosses the x, so we write none. It crosses the y-axis at 0, 3. Okay, so now would be a good time maybe to shut off the camera and try example 5 on your own if you'd like. I'm going to go ahead and do it, but if you want to shut it off and then check your work, that would be great. So identify the x and y intercept. X equals -2. So once again, I know it's one of these two. And I can always tell because there's one variable. If we have an x and a y, like we did above, x and a y, we get just a normal line. X and a y, we get a normal line. But when we have only an x or only a y, like these last two examples on page 6, then we know they're going to be the special case. So as we said on the last page, when it's only x, that means this line is only going to go through the x-axis, and it's going to go through at -2. So remember, it's not that point. It's going to be the line that goes through that point. So I set down my straight edge and draw this line, and we can now see that if it only passes through the x-axis, then it is going to be a vertical line. So again, it is a line, so it does need arrows on both ends. And it's a line that only goes through the x-axis. See how there is no y in the equation? Notice it never touches the y-axis. This means only passes through the x-axis, and it passes through at -2. So now that we have our graph, now we can answer the questions. So the x-intercept and the y-intercept. So the x-intercept, I know, always has y equals 0, so I can go ahead and put that in. And I look on the x-axis and I see it crosses the x-axis at -2. So the x-intercept would be -2, 0. The y-intercept, I look at the graph and I go, well, that pink line never crosses through the y-axis. So since it never crosses through the y-axis, I write none. There is no y-intercept. So we can kind of draw a conclusion here. On horizontal lines, they only have an y-intercept and they never cross the x. Vertical lines only have an x-intercept and they never cross the y unless they lie right on top of it, of course. So that finishes up lesson 2 for us. I also posted lesson 3 notes, so if you haven't printed those yet, you should print those now, stop the video, and then we'll pick up at the page 1 of lesson 3 notes. So lesson 3 notes are titled Slope of a Line and Rate of Change. So slope of a line and rate of change. This is lesson number 3. So we've spoke briefly about several of these things before we left for vacation, but this will be a good review. So slope, remember, is how steep a line is. but also another name for slope is rate of change. So they're synonymous. I can use the word slope or I can use the word rate of change, and they mean the same thing. Slope is designated by the letter M for monte. It's French. It was René Descartes that came up with the coordinate plane, so that's why he picked the letter M, I'm pretty sure, because it's monte, like steepness of a mountain. Slope. So there's a lot of ways to describe slope. So we use the letter M. Remember when we were writing equations and graphing equations before break? And we said that M is the slope and 0, b is the y-intercept. And we also said slope was rise over run when we're looking at a graph. And then 0b we said was the y-intercept. So we learned in the last section, anytime you have the y-intercept, x is 0. So notice I plugged 0 in, and then whatever this constant is at the end of your equation, that is the y value of your y-intercept. So what's in front of x is m, the slope, which is rise over run. The constant, the number without an x at the end of the equation, put a 0 in front of it because y-intercept always has x0, and 0, b is where your graph is going to cross the y-axis. So those were things we learned before break. So now we're just formalizing the definitions. So vertical change over horizontal change. That's what this means. Rise is vertical change, run is horizontal change. Or we can say change in y, because rise is, you can see the y-axis is vertical and the x-axis is horizontal. So change in x. Our most common ways of referring to slope, though, are these two. So I would highlight those two or box those two. When we're using a graph, we generally use rise over run. When we're given 2 points, that's when we usually use this formula, and this is not read y squared, it's read y sub 2 minus y sub 1 over x sub 2 minus x sub 1. I like to think of it as the second y minus the first y over the second x minus the first x. And that is the slope formula, and you use that whenever you're given 2 points. So when you're given a graph, you usually use the rise over run. When you're given 2 points to find the slope, you do the second y minus the first y over the second x minus the first x. And this is an odd formula in that it begins with y. We're so used to doing everything alphabetically, x first, then y. But the slope formula does begin with y. So y's must be in the numerator, x's in the denominator. So let's practice these new formulas. Studies show that if you write something 7 times, you have it memorized. So as I do these 4, I'm going to write the slope formula each time. That way I'll have it memorized. And like I said, maybe go along with me on A and B, then shut your video off, try and do C and D on your own, and then you can turn it back on and check it. Because really you learn the most from practicing on your own and making mistakes and realizing what those mistakes are. So I'm going to do all of them, obviously, because I want you to have the right answers to study, but it would be good to shut it off every now and then and do some on your own. So here's the keywords. Find the slope. So that tells me I need to use one of these formulas. Well, I'm given 2 points, so 2 points, we generally use the formula m equals. That's how I show the reader what it is I'm finding. I'm finding the slope. So m equals, and then I'm going to write the formula because like I said, if you write something 7 times, you have it memorized. Second y minus first y over second x minus first x. And usually beginning students kind of like to have these labeled. So if you haven't done this for a while, or you don't remember it, or maybe you never learned it, it's a good idea to label your points. This is my first x, this is my first y, this is my second x, this is my second y. So then I can just plug it straight into the formula. And it is a fraction, so just like other fractions, it does need to be simplified. So second y is -2 minus the first y, 4, over second x, -4, minus the first x, -3. So be careful with these double negatives. See how there's a minus in the formula, and you're subtracting a negative. So -2 minus 4. -4 minus -3. A lot of students will just turn that into a single negative, and that's incorrect. Minus from the formula, a negative you're subtracting. So really what it's going to turn into is a big plus sign. So double negatives will turn into a plus. So this will simplify as -6 over -1. And you should have learned in previous classes, anytime you divide two negatives, you get a positive. So that means my slope is 6, or 6 over 1. If I was graphing it, I'd want to keep it as 6 over 1 because it's rise over run. So you could do that, or m equals 6 over 1. If you were making a graph, that's the form you would want it in. And 6 and 6 over 1 are the same thing, right? But you do have to simplify your fraction to get full points. So remember, two negatives in division turns into a positive. 6 divided by 1 is 6. Okay, let's do one more together. And then, like I said, I would recommend you shutting off your computer and try the next two on your own. So let's label our points again. First x, first y, second x, second y. Then let's write the formula to help us remember it. Second y minus first y over second x minus first x. So second y is 5 minus -2, there's that double negative again, over second x, -1, minus 4. So I immediately make any double negatives positive so I don't lose that, and that gives me 7 over -5. And generally when we're using slope or writing a fraction, we move that negative up to the numerator, because when we go to do rise over run, that means go down 7, run 5. So we kind of like to have that negative with the top number. So down 7, run 5. And that is our slope. So let's label it as such. So usually at this time I have students ask, well, why don't you change that into a mixed number? Well, slope is rise over run. A mixed number would not give me my rise, would not give me my run. So yes, we do simplify the fractions. If there's a double negative or some number common, we do simplify that, but we never change them into mixed numbers, because then we can't get our rise and our run from the for the graph. Okay, so if I was you, I would turn off the video now and try these next two on your own. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and do this next one. So we have C, x1 and y1, x2 and y2. So now I'm ready to plug it into the formula. So again, I'm going to write the formula so I can have it memorized. So m equals second y minus first y.